Hey, all you girls, boys, and non-binaries out there. This is Ron Dawson, and I am producer and co-producer and co-host of Dungeons and Durags, a podcast you can find wherever you find your podcasts. And against my better judgment, I wanted to do a reaction video to Ben Shapiro's reaction video to the trailer for Showtime's Everything's Gonna Be All White. Where do I start? Ben. I'm doing this because I just feel like I need to get the frustration out. And for those of you who may see this, perhaps it can impart some wisdom, some empathy, and some understanding of the issues that are brought up in the trailer that Ben so callously and dispassionately and ignorantly, I would say, tosses aside. And I'm gonna be honest with you. Those of you who listen to the podcast probably know about my journey as a Black man, reconnecting with my Blackness, and I have this history of having been on both sides of the political spectrum in terms of where my personal particular ideologies were. And I now definitely more towards the left, although I think of myself as someone who's fairly reasoned and reasonable, and my passion isn't really left or right as it is justice and doing this what is right and what is compassionate. And I always tried to listen to both sides of debates and arguments. And I actually used to listen to Ben Shapiro's podcast because of all the right wing influencers that were out there. His was the only one that I could even stomach. And having been someone who whose faith has been important to me for a number of years, currently I'm in sort of like a deconstruction phase about that. But for the most part, for the longest time, faith has been something important to me. And a lot of, you could say, of my current points of view kind of stem from the better parts of the Christian faith that I've had. There are lots of issues that I have with the current Christian church, but that's another video. And one of the reasons why I used to stomach Ben was because he is a devout Jewish man, and he wears his yarmulke every day. And he was someone who I used to think, even though he had political beliefs that were different than mine, I feel like he was someone who really tried to at least share his point of view as they align with his Jewish faith. And I just got to say, that's not something that I've really been seeing from him in the past few years. He's really leaned into the political right. He's really leaned into Trumpism. He's really leaned into basically, kowtowing to his audience and doing things that he knows are good for his audience, which I would bet are largely right-wing evangelicals as opposed to conservative Jews. A few years ago, he had a prominent Christian pastor on his show who's a right-wing pastor, and this person was pretty much giving the the Christian doctrine on Ben's show, and Ben was giving no pushback. Now, it's not a religious show, and it's a political show, but I just kind of felt like there's no way in a million years if a rabbi had got on a Christian show and started saying that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, that Christian host would not push back. And so the fact that Ben had allowed this right-wing evangelical to come on the show, really preach the Christian message and the importance of believing Jesus, and that for Ben as a devout Jewish man to offer no pushback, I just felt like, well, I know why he's not. It's because he knows that a large part of his audience are right-wing evangelicals. Anyway, all that to say is I had to stop listening to him just because it was just too hard. And for someone who is empirically intelligent and educated, I kind of feel like he's purposefully obtuse about a lot of different things because, again, I think it appeals to his audience. And so he has this reaction to the Showtime documentary, Everything's Going to Be All White. And I want to address some of the things that he addresses as it relates to this trailer. And it starts with him kind of pitching a movie that his network has created. It's called Shut In. He's talking about how it's a narrative. It sounds like it's a fictional narrative thriller type of thing, and saying it has values that you like. And he uses the pitch for his movie coming up as a jumping off point to criticize everything's going to be all right. So that's where we're going to start with. And then piece by piece, I'll break it down and we'll address some of the things that he's talking about. I have watched the full documentary series. And so I'm coming from a point of view where I've actually seen the film series to which he is commenting. Now, admittedly, he's commenting on the trailer, but his comments are geared really towards the whole series, as if this trailer one represents that. And he makes no comment about the fact that these are just comments on the trailer. His commentary is really on the whole series. And so let's hear what he has to say. And, as he stops it, I'll stop it, and I'll reflect on his reflections.
It has values that you like, but in a package that you actually want to watch.
He's talking about his movie, Shut In.
The reason I mention this is because Hollywood is completely dominated by the wild left. It is completely dominated by the radical left. If you look at the Oscar nominations, you can tell this, by the way. The Oscar nominations came out yesterday. They include The Power of the Dog, which is running away with all the awards. The reason is because it's about gay cowboys, of course.
All right, let's start with that. I have another podcast that I do called Crossing the 180, where I interview filmmakers, and I frequently get the opportunity to go to screenings. And I was able to go to a screening of Power of the Dog at Netflix. It personally was not my taste, not because it was about a gay cowboy, but because I felt it was like extremely boring. I'm just going to be honest. And I'm not the only person who's felt like that. But the performances in there are undeniably empirically brilliant. Okay. So for him to say that the reason why it's getting nominated is because it's just because it's about a gay cowboy is extremely reductive and insulting. I bet you he hasn't even seen the movie. And so, like, if he were to comment on the fact that the movie was boring and can't understand why it's getting nominated, fine. But just to say that the reason why it's getting nominated is because it's about a gay cowboy, again, just kind of speaks to what he and where he is coming from. So yes, I thought the movie was boring. It wouldn't have been my choice, but I can recognize the brilliant cinematography, the brilliant acting by the work that's done by the actors who are in it, and the storyline as it relates to the homosexuality of the characters is not even in your face. It's just frustrating here. Make that comment, that reductive comment. So that's step number one. We're not even a minute into his video, and he already has issues.
The other movie that is nominated that ought not be is Don't Look Up, which of course is not even a good movie according to Rotten Tomatoes, but it does make fun of people who are quote unquote global warming deniers. So that means that they're bad. So,
all right, let's talk about Don't Look Up. I saw Don't Look Up. I liked it. It is admittedly one of the most divisive movies that came out last year. I've commented that on my social media feed. It seems like every comment about Don't Look Up is either someone who absolutely loves it or someone who thinks it's the stupidest movie that was ever made. Okay. And does it deserve a Best Picture nomination? I don't know. But again, there's no denying that as a satire about global warming, it is extremely funny and makes some very astute observations. And I think he makes another comment about it that I'm going to comment on.
So that movie is nominated for Best Picture. There is a trailer for a new series.
All right. So basically saying, because Don't Look Up, it's about climate change deniers being bad people. And that's the reason why he's nominated. First of all, climate change deniers are bad people. Like, the science is undisputed. Well, it's disputed by people who have political agendas, but for the overwhelming majority of rational scientists on this planet believe that the human race is accelerating global warming. And so this is a satire about that. And yes, it makes fun of the people who are who go against it. And frankly, one of the comments I've heard about the film is that it almost seems too real. Like, the people that it makes fun of are almost too much like people in the real world. And so it almost doesn't feel satirical because it doesn't go far enough, which just kind of comments on just how crazy our world is, that you can make a satire where even the people who are supposed to be jokes seem too real. So again, who knows if you've even seen the movie? He's not commenting on the movie itself. He's just saying the only reason why it's nominated is because it's about climate change deniers. And, when he says that Rotten Tomatoes says it's not a good movie, he knows that Rotten Tomatoes is an amalgamation of hundreds of reviews. So it's not like there's an entity, Rotten Tomatoes. It's a bunch of reviewers, a bunch of movie critics, and they all chime in about the movie. And, it would not be the first time that movie that maybe wasn't as great or critically acclaimed got nominated. So anyway, let's go on.
Series on Showtime that I think is pretty indicative of leftist Hollywood. This trailer is for a 3-part docuseries titled Everything's Gonna Be All White. You see, because it's like a pun because it's white instead of right. You see it. The actress and comedian Amanda Seales is...
First of all, yeah, that is funny. Very good, Ben. You cut that. It is funny. It's supposed to be funny. That's not a dig.
The host of it. It also features...
Oh, my goodness. So, again, he's making a video about something he knows absolutely nothing about. Amanda Seales is not the host of this series. There is no host. She's one of the people who's interviewed. She doesn't even show up that often. She shows up more in part 3. But the fact that he's saying that she is a host, another clear example of people like him who make comments about things like this when they don't know what the F they're talking about.
Geniuses like Margaret Cho, Jamel Hill, and Ibram X. Kendi. Ooh, exciting stuff. So
again, suggesting that these people that he's mentioned are not worthy of being taken seriously, I guess because Margaret Cho is a comedian. Jamel Hill is only a sports writer, so he thinks. I'm sure she does a lot more than just write about sports, and she does a podcast and she writes for The Atlantic. And we know I can tell you where he stands with Ibram X. Kendi, who has one of the most recognized and respected books on the topic of being an anti-racist, which, of course, according to Ben Shapiro, there's no such thing as racism in the world anymore. And so he already has beefs with these people, and so he's denigrating their the fact that they're in this documentary series because he already doesn't agree with anything that they stand for, and he probably thinks they're not worthy of being listened to.
Here is the trailer. We're going to break it down for you because, again, this demonstrates what Hollywood thinks of you and what it thinks of America. Here's Showtime's Everything's Gonna Be All White trailer. It says, warning, this trailer may trigger white people.
Most about white people.
Here's the funny thing. Ben Shapiro is being triggered. He is actually doing exactly what the trailer is warning is going to happen. I thought that was funny.
Is when they pretend like they're the victim.
Can you pause it for a second? Okay, so first of all, I hate when white people pretend. Okay, Jussie Smollett, anyone? Like anytime in here? It turns out people in a victim culture like pretending they're victims all the time. But the assumption is that if a white person says they're a victim, they must be pretending because America is inherently evil and filled with evil white people who pretended victimization, which is interesting. Here is play what the rest of what this lady has to say is even crazier.
All right. So first of all, Amanda Seales is a comedian. She's a very smart, intelligent comedian who's very well read, and she uses her intelligence and education in her wit and her comedy, and she's making a clear reference to essentially the quote unquote Karens of the world, and she's applying that analogy to white people in general, largely as a joke, but also with some satirical commentary about the kind of things that happen on in this country. I don't think he doesn't know that, but he doesn't speak to that because he knows what his audience wants to hear.
What's also annoying is when they kill us.
It's when they kill us. So just on a proportional level, the vast majority of crime, violent crime, is intraracial, meaning white people tend to commit violent crime against white people, black people tend to commit violent crime against black people. The odds that a black person is going to be victimized, like killed by a white person, is way lower on a proportional level than the odds that a white person is going to be killed by a black person in this country. This has been true for a very long time. Okay, so this notion that white people are just sort of walking around ready to murder black people is obviously statistically untrue, but it is also the premise of an entire Showtime docuseries. So here we go. We'll continue.
Oh my gosh. Every time this man talks, it's frustrated. I wish the guy one day I could get in a debate with this dude. He's way more read up on things than I am, but so much of what he says can be like easily countered by a 5-year-old. Okay. Calm down. So when she's talking about when they kill us, let me say up front, what he's saying is absolutely true. Statistically speaking, you are more likely to be killed by somebody who looks like you than someone who doesn't. Okay. In terms of, which is one of the frustrations that black people have whenever white people talk about black on black crime, because there's white on white crime. There's just as much white on white crime as there is black on black crime, but you never hear, people on the right talk about white on white crime. So 100%, Ben, you're right. You're more likely to be killed by someone who looks like you than someone else. Again, and I don't think he doesn't know this, what Amanda is referring to is basically police brutality. And when those in power who are white use that power to kill, oftentimes unarmed black people or people of color, statistically and proportionally out of whack in terms of the amount of times that happens. I think he knows that. That is what she's referring to. She's not talking about white people randomly walking around killing black people. She's not talking about white and black crime. She's talking about a institution that has been created by white supremacy, that has a police system in which there are black people for decades who have, going way back to the early 20th century, being disproportionately killed by those in power who happen to be white. That is what she's referring to. Again, I think he knows that, but he's causing this red herring to make it seem like it's something else.
What is fragile about whiteness when everything has been constructed around it?
Every part of who I am has been distorted or criminalized.
Okay, pause it right there. You know the person speaking right there? You can't see it. If you can't see it, the person speaking right there is Linda Sarsour. Every part of me has been criticized or demonized. You hang out with terrorists. You are an open anti-Semite, but she's a victim. So just to get this straight, no white person is a victim, but Linda Sarsour is a victim. Okay, let the propaganda continue.
I won't comment too much on this because, admittedly, I do not know a lot about Linda Sarsour. I'm not part of the Jewish community, so I don't want to get in. That's not my battle to have. What I can say about this, she shows up very little in this documentary. It is not about her being a victim. And one of the things that's very true about Ben Shapiro that I've noticed is that he's very passionate about anti-Semitism, as well he should be. Which is why I find it so ironic that he supports someone like Trump, who is lauded and put in power and encouraged by some of the biggest anti-Semites in this country. But I won't go there. So again, I think he's having an emotional reaction to seeing this person who, to him, he sees as a terrorist, he sees as someone who's a raving anti-Semite. Again, I don't know enough about her to comment on whether or not she is. I just know that she shows up very little in this documentary, not so much so that it's worth denigrating the entire documentary because of her small presence in it.
Or criminalized.
It's really just a bunch of white lies.
White lies.
We're storming the Capitol! You're not patriots. You're ridiculous.
Well, Margaret Cho, speaking of ridiculous people, she's saying that the people who storm the Capitol are ridiculous. Now, I agree that if you storm the Capitol wearing buffalo horns, you are, in fact, ridiculous. But then the next move in this trailer is to connect those ridiculous people and white supremacy generally with President Trump. So they kept trying to say this, by the way, that January 6th was about white supremacy, and it was always a stretch. It was about a bunch of people who had been lied to and told that the election was stolen and believed that they were saving democracy by invading the Capitol building and preventing the certification of the election. They were wrong, and many of them were stupid, and many of them were criminal. But there's not, I'm sure there were white supremacists among them, but the idea that the entire thing was motivated by quote unquote white supremacy, that this was somehow about black people, is kind of an amazing claim, but never let the facts get in the way of a good narrative. We'll get to more on this.
Again, I have to take a lot of deep breaths watching videos by Ben Shapiro. January 6th. I don't even know where to effing start with January 6th and this trailer and Ben and his comments on it. Let's start with the fact that the reason why people make a connection of white supremacy to January 6th is for a number of reasons. One, it could be part of the reason could be the fact that there were so many people there who were waving Confederate flags. I'm sure that's a big part of it. Another part of the issue is that oftentimes people like Ben Shapiro and those like him, whenever they talk about quote unquote white supremacy, their definition of white supremacy is when you wear white robes and a hood. Like that is what makes white supremacists. For the overwhelming number of people of color who, when we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about white supremacy ideology, which is the fact that you have a country that has been created on the fact that it was built up as an opportunity for it was built on the backs of people of color, and it was created in a sense of being able to support the white government, the government. And so when people are talking about white supremacy ideology, that is what they're talking about. They're talking about a system that's been created to benefit the white person. And a lot of those benefits are still in effect. And a lot of those benefits disproportionately negatively affect people of color. And a lot of the laws that are in effect still today come from that. And so it's not about saying all white people are evil, because all white people obviously aren't evil. It's about saying there are some things in this country that benefit primarily white people. And January 6th was a date that will go down in infamy, where you saw literally 2,000 plus white people storm the Capitol, and they weren't shot. Well, obviously, at least one was, but for the most part, they weren't shot at or tased or tear gassed. There was no army coming in to sweep them out. They literally got all the way in to the Congress, the halls of the Senate and the House of Representatives to piss and crap and tear up stuff and do all kinds of things that if any person of color had attempted to do, if even a quarter of the people had assembled at the Capitol had been people of color, you would have had police out there in storms. Everyone knows that. And that's what a lot of people talk about when they talk about white supremacy as it relates to January 6th. And that's when they talk about what 2,500 white people were able to do that had never been done in the history of this country, which is storming the Capitol and stopping the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another. That is what people talk about when they talk about January 6th being tied to white supremacy. And for him to say that if you storm the Capitol wearing buffalo horns, you're an idiot, as if everyone, like that had to be the qualification of being an idiot. You had to be wearing buffalo horns. It's just, again, so dismissive of what that day was. Just go and start Googling the video and photo images from that day and remember what that day was like. And it's just so insulting for him and for the people who, and for what this country represents, for what he says he represents, for what he says that is important to him, to be so dismissive of the insurrectionists and what they did on that day. And I don't even want to get into him saying that how it's not tied to Trump. Okay. And so, again, being very dismissive because he knows that's what his audience like. So at this point, he starts doing a commercial for one of his sponsors. Let's see, the sponsor is Helix. So do not buy Helix. Do not buy Helix, since for me personally, I won't be buying any Helix mattresses since they like to support Ben Shapiro. Anyway, but I'm sure there's enough people who like Ben Shapiro who will be buying Helix mattresses. So more power to them. So let's skip over his commercial. Okay.
Ignorance. Actually, no. It seems to me that the definition of whiteness is ignorance.
Of the definitions of American whiteness is ignorance.
Okay, one of the definitions of American whiteness is ignorance. Actually, no. It seems to me that the definition of ignorance is ignorance. There have been a lot of really smart American white people, as it turns out. And whiteness is not coincident with ignorance. That's just racist. If being white means that you're ignorant, then honestly, I fail to see how this doesn't turn into racism like right quick. If whiteness is ignorant, then what about educationally underperforming groups? Is that also coincident with ignorance or what? Because if it's all racial essentialism all the way down, then it's racial essentialism all the way down. Or we might, not do that racist thing this lady is doing. I also love the graphic there, which shows a bunch of white supremacists and then Trump hugging the American flag. Because it's the same thing. When Trump hugs the American flag.
All right. First, let's talk about his comment on her comment about whiteness and ignorance. Currently, as I make this video, for the past year or so, there has been a growing campaign and movement in this country to stamp out anything that even smacks of education on topics as relates to critical race theory, slavery, and whatnot. And so what she is talking about and what she is referring to, in which every person of color and most white people who are intelligent and who are intelligently honest would say that she's referring to the growing movement in this country to stamp out so much of our history that as it relates to people of color, as it relates to indigenous people, as it relates to so many things that we were not taught or we were only given a very sparse education of. That is what she is referring to. And so as we try this, one of the things that the documentary addresses are all these myths about history or all these things that we've been taught that we've now come to learn either didn't happen or didn't happen the way that we were taught. And the fight and the campaign, largely from the political right in this country, to stop that from happening. And a lot of that is from people who just happen to be white. And so that is what she's referring to. She's not saying that white people are inherently ignorant. She's saying that there's a growing movement, predominantly by people who are white in this country, to shut down the education of what actually history is about. And that is what she was referring to. Again, I think he knows this, but he's painting a narrative of what it is that she's supposedly saying, when it's so very clear to anyone who's intellectually honest that what she's talking about is a movement in this country to stop the education of historical facts, particularly as they relate to indigenous people and people of color.
It is just like somebody flying the Nazi flag, because the American flag is like the Nazi flag and Trump is a Nazi, get it? But it's not propaganda, guys. This is just an honest look at American race.
Okay, so here he's defending Trump hugging the American flag. Again, his defense of Trump is just so mind-boggling to me. Well, I guess it's not mind-boggling again, because I know he's doing it because he's a capitalist and he can make a lot of money off it from all the people who support Trump. But honestly, for a lot of people in this country, the American flag has come to mean something negative, sadly. And it's come to mean that because there are millions of people in this country who raise that flag in conjunction with the Confederate flag. And so you see any photos or videos of Trump rallies, you're going to see the American flag flown with the Confederate flag, or flown with other type of overtly white supremacist flags. And so, yeah, that's going to happen, Ben, when you start mixing the American flag with people who say the kind of things that Trump says and does the kind of things that Trump does. And, if you or anyone for a second thinks that Trump has a love for his country the way he claims he has, then maybe you're not as smart as you claim you are, because I think most people know that Trump is a con man, and he knows how to say what he needs to say to get what he needs to get. And so, yeah, it's just crazy.
White people, we are not your problem. You are.
Should white people today feel any responsibility for slavery?
Hell yeah.
Okay, stop right there for a second. Okay, so we are not your problem. You are your problem. We weren't saying that you're our problem. Like, I'm confused as to why you think that white people, by and large, spend inordinate amounts of time thinking about how black people are their problem.
Does Ben not pay attention to the news? Like, how many news stories are there about white people complaining about Colin Kaepernick, complaining about CRT, complaining about anyone who speaks out against white supremacy ideology, or speaks out against racism or anything like that? That is what he's referring to when he says we're not your problem. Meaning, the Colin Kaepernicks of the world are not your problem, right? When Colin Kaepernick decides to take a knee in order to protest police brutality, what Willie D, the musician in that film, is saying when he says that you're your problem, he's saying the thing that Colin Kaepernick is, taking a knee about, the thing that Jamel Hill writes about, the thing about this, that the 1619 Project about, that so many people who happen to be white are complaining about, all stem from that white supremacy ideology. So that's what he means when he says you are your problem.
I sense the opposite. I sense that according to the Showtime documentary, people of color spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about how white people are their problem. So there's that.
As a person of color, and as many people of color would tell you, we can't go throughout this country without having to think about how, for not necessarily how white people are your problem. For some people, they may look at it like that, but how this system in this country, which again was designed for the benefit of white people, affects us, people of color. So yeah, that's something that's ingrained in us. Like, we have to go out the door thinking that. I think it's great that you don't have to, Ben. Maybe you do because you wear a yarmulke, and so in a sense that puts a target on your back as a Jewish man. And I'm sure there are some parts of this country where you would go, and those Trump supporters you love so much probably would be throwing stones and balls at you because you're Jewish. If you take that yarmulke off, you could walk through this world and not have this country and be able to continue to subsist in a way where the color of your skin is not going to put a target on your back. So that is what he's referring to.
Also, why should white people feel guilty about slavery in which they did not participate, in which they oppose? The sins of the ancestors visited upon the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of people who did a bad thing, or alternatively, the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of people who were not living here at the time. My ancestors only came to the United States in the early 20th century, so they had nothing to do with slavery, but I'm supposed to feel guilty for slavery that even my ancestors had nothing to do with? Is that the way that this is supposed to work? Oh, and then we get into some really good stuff. Then we get into white versus black Jesus.
All right. Of all the points he makes, I can understand this point, right? Should white people today feel, quote unquote, guilty about slavery? Personally, no, I don't think so. And I don't think the brother in the video who said that, I don't necessarily think he thinks that, but maybe he does. But the point that is made in the documentary series, and if Ben had watched it all the way through and then made a commentary, that would be one thing. But again, he's commenting on a 90-second, 2-minute trailer, and without putting any kind of disclaimer that this is just a commentary on the trailer, without acknowledging the fact that trailers sometimes show the most provocative pieces of something without telling the full picture because they want to get you to watch it. And so you just put any kind of disclaimer like that on that. But when people of color, when Black people, Indigenous people, when we talk about people today, white people today acknowledging slavery, what they're talking about is not for you to feel guilty about it, but for you to recognize the benefits that you still have because of slavery and Jim Crow and all the other kind of things that BIPOC people talk about. And there's so many people in this country who are trying to tell a narrative where they shouldn't have to reflect on those things, right? And so I think that is the issue that that gentleman was getting at was that it's not about feeling guilty about what your ancestors did. It's about understanding what your ancestors did, which again, people are trying to teach in schools. And there's a whole movement of people trying to change the narrative and trying to take it out of schools. So it's one, it's about understanding those things. And it's about reflecting on the fact of how you benefit from everything that happened beforehand, and that some of the things that you talk about and some of the things that you complain about as it relates to either crime in this country or the state of the Black community or the state of the indigenous peoples community, without reflecting on, okay, what happened prior, what happened in our history that kind of led up to the communities that Black people and indigenous people live in. But when you ignore redlining and the effect that that had, when you ignore, all of the kind of things that happened, post-Revolutionary War and the Great Construction era, that if you don't understand that, then you lack the perspective and empathy needed to understand what it is when BIPOC people talk about either white privilege, or they talk about this need for reparations, or if they talk about the conditions in which BIPOC people live today that have been caused by the past. So it's not about feeling guilty. It's about having understanding and empathy, which can only come through education. And again, that is what the general idea that gentleman was getting at. And if you actually watch the documentary series, that's what you come away with.
Okay, here we go.
White Jesus or Black Jesus?
Jesus was not white. Think of geography. Ain't no way Jesus walked around with blonde hair and blue eyes.
Go back for a second. Sorry. I noticed you've created a false binary. White Jesus versus Black Jesus. How about Jewish Jesus? Like Middle Eastern Jewish Jesus. Truth is, Jesus probably looked like my father-in-law, who's a Moroccan Jew. One thing that Jesus was not was African. Right? We know that because Jews of the time were not African in ethnicity. So it's not white Jesus, like Nordic Jesus versus Black Jesus. But according to Showtime, it's one or the other because they're stupid. They're really dumb.
All right, let me address this. Again, this is one of those comments that's a short piece taken out of context from the video. The documentary series in no way proposes that Jesus was a Black man. It specifically talks about him being from the Jewish area. It makes reference to the biblical description of Jesus of having bronze skin and curly hair, but that can describe a Jew of the area. In no way does the documentary series suggest that Jesus was African. The idea of white Jesus versus Black Jesus, as the person was talking about, is really the idea of how white people refer and relate to Jesus versus the way Black people relate and refer to Jesus. That is the theme that is addressed in the documentary series when he talks about white Jesus versus Black Jesus. It's like, if you look at the stats in this country, in terms of the number of evangelicals in this country who are white and their political views and how they look at Jesus, and the number of devout Christians in this country who are Black and their political views and how they look at Jesus, two totally different things. White Jesus versus Black Jesus. Now, the documentary goes into more detail about how throughout churches of America and throughout history, we are actually served up images primarily of a white Jesus. We're taught that Jesus, for the most part, was white. Like, if you come up in this country, you are going to think that Jesus is white and blonde hair and blue eyes. And so that is specifically addressed in the documentary series, but there in no way does it suggest that Jesus was a Black man or African man.
Ain't no way Jesus walked around with blonde hair and blue eyes.
White culture fears the end of the world. For us as Native people, the end of the world already happened like multiple times.
Wait, well, hold on. When white people fear the end of the world, I have a question. Doesn't everyone sort of fear the end of the world? Like, that would be bad? And again, the breakdown of white people into one giant group, as opposed to multiple groups, all of whom have at some time been victimized throughout history. I mean, they think the people who made this documentary are like Whoopi Goldberg. They think Jews are white people. So if we're talking about Jews, people facing the end of the world multiple times, yeah, there's that. But also, this is like again, the idea is that if your group was uniquely victimized in America, this can now be blamed on the entire white group of humans in America. I mean, it's just racism. It's just racism straight up from Showtime. Here we go.
Let's address this. First of all, let's address this racism issue. One of the issues and one of the problems in the discourse that we try to have about race in this country is that for a lot of white people, their definition of racism is different than a person of color's definition of racism. Again, as I mentioned earlier, for a lot of white people, their definition of racism is white hoods and swastikas and burning crosses. But when people of color, for the most part, are talking about racism, we're talking about, again, racist structures in this country that were developed to benefit white people, and how those structures today still negatively affect people of color. So that's for one. For number two, the comment that he's like glomming onto, where this guy says that, you know, white people feel the end of the world, and he's saying, you know, the end of the world has happened for natives, you know, a couple of times over. Again, one, he's talking about generally the white system in America, and he's trying to make a point about how there is sort of like a sense of the end times, and particularly around the right and the right evangelical culture. And there are a lot of movies about apocalyptic futures and whatnot. And so I think he's making a high level commentary about that fear when he says white people fear the end of the world. It's like there are a lot of movies about the end of the world. And he's saying for his people, they've already seen the end of, like the Native American people in this country have had multiple apocalypses already. And that's what he's trying to say. And that's what makes me so mad when I hear comments like this. It's just this profound lack of empathy and compassion for an entire race of people have dealt with. And he's saying, my people have already literally seen the end of their world. Like, not even figuratively, literally seen the end of the world multiple times. And so that is what he's referring to. And that is, you know, that particular gentleman actually shows up a lot in the documentary. And I just think he's an amazing individual. But that's the commentary that he's making. And when he's talking about, again, when he's talking about white people, he's talking about just like people like Ben Shapiro, frankly, who want to maintain the status quo of systems in this country that were created to benefit the white person. And anytime there's attempts in order to kind of change the narrative or to really teach history or education, people like Ben want to tear it down because it's taking away the values that really make this country great.
Symbols and monuments, these are mementos of racism.
Bring that statue down. Put up a TCBY yogurt or something. Everybody can get behind it.
Tear those statues down, because statues, yeah, and put up a yogurt store. So much humor. And this is America. What is? This is a dumb documentary? I hope not, because then we're trashed.
Truth has to be
I think it's so, I find it very interesting that he completely glosses over the commentary of what the statues that gentleman was talking about. That there are thousands of Confederate statues throughout this country. They were put up precisely for the point of being a message to the Black people in a post-Civil War era. Earlier, I said post-revolutionary, meant Civil War. In a post-Civil War era, Reconstruction era of, yeah, even though the South lost, we're still in control. We're still in charge. And so to dismiss the significance of bringing down statues of people who literally were traitors to this nation, and for him to make no commentary on that, and to kind of dismiss the guy's joke about, you know, put up a TCBY instead, again, it's like him being purposefully obtuse as to what the guy is really addressing and talking about. And for him to dismiss the joke, for him to dismiss the comment, for him to not even like any kind of commentary on what it means to bring down those statues, what it has meant for Black people throughout history to have to every day walk by statues that represent a whole group of people who wanted to enslave you, right? If there were statues of Hitler around this country, I guarantee you Ben Shapiro would be on the front lines wanting to bring those statues down, okay? And it just, again, reeks of his hypocrisy. in terms of what he says he stands for.
Told about history.
From the people of color point of view. Okay, stop it right there for a second. What is the people of color point of view? It is from the POC POV. Is there only one? Do all people of color have the same point of view? Again, there's that racial essentialism all the way down from Showtime. This is Hollywood.
Make sure that...
No, Ben, you're right. All people of color don't have the same point of view. And if you were to actually watch the documentary, you would see that they interview Asian people, they interview indigenous people, they interview Latinx people, they interview Black people. And when they say the point of view of people of color, what they mean is each one of these groups of people has their own perspective of what it means to be that kind of person of color in a country that was created for the power and the empowerment of white people. And so much of our education, so much of our history is from the point of view of people who are white. And this documentary series is saying this is going to be a piece of education from the point of view of people of color. So that's what they mean by that. And again, he makes this comment, this dig on Hollywood, and that this video represents leftist Hollywood. The irony of that comment is, again, if he had actually watched the documentary, he would know this. This documentary criticizes Hollywood. Particularly part 3 is all about media, Hollywood specifically, on how it has painted images of people of color. It talks a lot about how Asians have been portrayed. They get into David Carradine and Mickey Rooney and all these other things that have had big issues. They get into the Mandingo perspective. They get into all these different negative imageries. They get into blackface and yellowface, and they talk about sports teams and making whole groups of people mascots. And when it comes in terms of, referring to this documentary as something on the left, they dig into people on the left. There's a section of the video where they criticize, Elizabeth Warren for claiming to be Native American. And that gentleman, that Native American gentleman who spoke earlier talks about that. Like, this video, obviously most of it is not even really, you can't even really say it's geared towards the right. It's really just geared towards racist structures that have been created and lots of lies that have been told. But this is by no means a left-wing propaganda piece. This is a piece of art that specifically speaks to issues of race and what it's like to be a person of color in this particular country. And it does not pull punch. It even has a section of the film where it criticizes In the Heights, which was, created, Lin-Manuel Miranda's piece. He didn't direct it, but obviously is based on his Tony Award-winning Broadway musical. He was the biggest name behind it. The movie even criticizes him to some extent, and all the colorism debates that surrounded the movie In the Heights that came out last year. And they interview Afro-Latina people from the Washington Heights area. So again, this movie is not shy about criticizing anyone in Hollywood or politics who has done something that has to some extent hurt people of color in this country. And again, if Ben had actually watched the documentary and could comment on it, he would have known that. So all that to say that this is not some type of left-wing propaganda piece. This is a piece that is extremely well thought out and passionate, that has lots of different voices who are making very valid points based on history and facts. And if Mr. Shapiro had actually watched the documentary and made comments on that, as opposed to judging the entire documentary based on a 2-minute trailer, which in and of itself at its face is disingenuous. Like, no self-respecting movie critic would, I'm not saying he's a movie critic. Sometimes I think he likes to think he's one. I've heard his show enough to know that he thinks, kind of fancies himself one, but no self-respecting movie critic would critique an entire film, pass judgment on it based solely on a trailer. And this is exactly what he's doing.
These stories are told from our perspective.
This there's always hope. You know what I'm saying? We don't give up.
It's about obliterating systemic and institutionalized racism.
This is a wild place, y'all. It's a wild place. I know Harriet and Frederick be up there just like, what is they gonna do?
The amount of time that they've spent reading Frederick Douglass, the people who made this documentary, I'm going to suggest is fairly low. Because you know what Frederick Douglass didn't do? Was crap all over the American flag or suggest that America was institutionally, irrevocably racist. He suggested that America was systemically racist because he had been a slave and was living in a time when slavery was still legal. But his whole point was that the American flag should stand for everyone, including him, and that America's fundamental institutions, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, those could be fulfilled. They were promissory notes that had to be fulfilled. But we've moved way beyond Martin Luther King or Frederick Douglass for the modern racial left. The modern racial Hollywood left is mainly about early Malcolm, and not even late Malcolm X, not racially conciliatory Malcolm X, like the opposite. We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.
We're in a battle for our values, is what he says. I'm going to read you something from Frederick Douglass. Frederick, I don't know what's going on there. Frederick Douglass, one of the most famous speeches that he gave was this one, which is, what does the 4th of July mean to the slave? Okay. I'm just going to read a section of it. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him more bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the world, of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. So what he's saying here, I think there are a lot of people of color who would say that a lot of these kind of apply to them today in terms of what happens in this country. Obviously, there isn't slavery anymore. But one of the things that's really frustrating for a lot of people of color is when people like Ben Shapiro take out of context the works and words of people like Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass for their own benefit, for their own narrative, right? People love to drag out, the right wings love to drag out Martin Luther King and all the quotes that he made about I have a dream and what forth. But they don't ever want to quote his letter from Birmingham jail, where some of the greatest criticisms and the most biting criticism he makes against the white clergy of the day. They don't talk about that famous interview he did with Mike Wallace, where Mike Wallace says, what about pulling yourself up from bootstraps? And MLK pretty much gives him sort of almost a CRT lesson. He says, we didn't have any boots to pull straps up from. Mike Wallace says, what about the Jew in this country who's made it? And King goes on to tell him no other race in this country were slaves for, 300 some odd years, 200 years or whatever. And so Google that interview with Mike Wallace, Martin Luther King, and listen to what he has to say. And it's like a miniature CRT lesson. Yet lots of people on the right would like to bring up Martin Luther King for their narrative, forgetting the fact that at the time that Martin Luther King was killed and shot, he was extremely unpopular among white people in the country at the time. He was probably as unpopular among large swaths of white people in America at the time as Colin Kaepernick is today. And but now 40 some odd 50 some odd years later, he's a hero. But again, to take all these quotes out of context. And even though Malcolm X did become more conciliatory towards the end, he never really gave up a lot of his thoughts and beliefs in terms of what was happening in this country. I mean, one of the reasons why he left the Nation of Islam was because he didn't like the hypocrisy that he saw there. Like, he was a man who really believed in the faith that he was going after, and when he was hip deep in the Nation of Islam and the work that they were doing, it was good work for the Black community at the time. When he saw hypocrisy that he didn't like, and then when he traveled in the world and met other Muslims who happened to be white, he realized that, okay, the white man in and of itself is not the devil. But he didn't like disavow the fact that there was still racism in the country that needed to be dealt with. He just changed his outlook on all white people not being evil or whatnot. And so, but of course, Ben Shapiro was not going to mention that. So I know this video is super long. I don't even know who's going to watch it to the end. If you do, I appreciate you and appreciate for doing it. It's about understanding, man. It's about compassion. It's about really having an understanding of what people in this country have lived with, to understand what it means to grow up and see versions and visions of yourself that are so negative in Hollywood, in the media, and to want to make a better life for yourself and to help people on the other side really understand what you're dealing with. And then when I hear people like Ben Shapiro, who so casually dismiss a lot of the valid claims that are made in the video without even having the decency to watch it first and then make comments, or at least, if you're going to make a comment about the trailer, at least say some kind of disclaimer that, hey, I can only comment on the trailer. I don't know if, trailers frequently take things out of context just to, get a rise out of you. I haven't actually seen it yet, so these are my comments on just the trailer, but they should not necessarily be held. The whole series should not be held up to this particular trailer. He doesn't even have the intellectual honesty to do that. And so, but of course he's not. And I bet you $1 million, like the person, who made this, Sasha Jenkins, I bet you $1 million he is read up way more in Frederick Douglass than Ben Shapiro is. So anyway, I have no idea where I'm going to post this video, but if I post it someplace where comments can be made, love to hear to know what you think. My name is Ron Dawson. Dungeons and Durags is the name of my podcast, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate the time you took to listen to what I had to say. Stay safe out there. And remember, having white privilege is not bad. Denying it is. And in the absence of biblical certainty, choose love. Peace.